how I ended up starting in human and organizational performance as far as it applies to safety was when I joined Los Alamos National Laboratory in 2003, during a period of a lot of safety incidents and security incidents. And I was the training manager for the nuclear facilities. Now, I had had a background in consulting. I'd worked in Silicon Valley and I'd worked in the UK. And I had worked with high reliability organizations. So organizations that have big consequences if they fail. So high technology organizations and banks. Okay, we didn't know at the time just how high reliability banks were before 2008, but it turns out that they really are. And and I was working with banks in the UK. And so I didn't really have a nuclear background, but I had a lot of training and training management experience. So I was managing the access training and, the basic training, as well as, on the job training and responding to corrective actions for the nuclear facilities. And we were having a lot of incidents, and I was getting back from investigations this list of corrective actions, like there was a slip, trip, or a fall, there was a minor injury, and somehow that required training. Like I needed to train people not to make mistakes. And that was absolutely absurd. And I think maybe because I was from the outside and hadn't been part of the system before, I was the one who said, well, this is ridiculous. Well, Todd was in my organization as well, much higher up on the food chain than me. And he agreed that it was ridiculous. And when we got to a point where the laboratory got shut down, we got pulled into trying to figure out how to actually change our safety performance in order to get the lab back up again. And we worked with INPO, which is the Nuclear Power Industries organization that had made a lot of they had a program called HU, Human Performance, and they had quite a bit to teach us. And then Shane Bush, who was within the DOE, he worked in Idaho. He had already started some of this working with INPO. And so ultimately, there was a bit of a cross Department of Energy effort that Todd and I were a part of to try and get the whole complex, the laboratory complex, up to snuff. And it was basically, this was very simple. Like back then it was just like, we can't punish people into not making mistakes. We can't have investigations and say that it's all human error. And then what are we going to do? Just fix the humans? We can't fix the humans. And that was really basically where we started.
Yeah. So do you work in the HOP area broadly, or do you specify, because we've asked you along to talk about psychological safety, but do you go?
So from Los Alamos, I left Los Alamos, went back into working as a consultant in Silicon Valley, and I was actually focused on emotional intelligence. So that was sort of when emotional intelligence became a really big thing. So I was developing leaders in that area. And then I went to work for Harvard. I've been working with them for about 8-9 years. And that's when I was introduced to the idea of psychological safety from Amy Edmondson, because Amy Edmondson's a Harvard professor. And so I would work with her. She would come into some of my programs and give lectures to my students. And so I lived down the street from Todd Conklin, right? Who wrote the 5 principles of organizational performance and pre-accident investigations and a ton of other best-selling safety books. And we noodle about this stuff, basically. We have dinner and talk and have geek talk. And basically he said, you really have to bring this concept of psychological safety and the stuff around emotional resilience and cognitive complexity that you do into the safety world. And it started with, I was the guest on the first 2 of Todd's pre-accident investigation podcasts.
I had to listen.
And then I've been on there a couple times more. And then just the pandemic made me not busy. And so then I started doing safety conferences. I just got invited to go to safety conferences out of the blue to talk about psychological safety because that became a big thing. So I'm an accidental safety person.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, by the sound of it, from stories I've heard. Yeah. So you mentioned complexity there. Obviously, I'd like to explore that idea before we kick off directly into psychological safety. So, yeah, as I asked earlier, the foundations of all this work to me seem to be in complexity and managing for emergent properties thereof and this sort of thing. So, in that sort of domain, is that where you see it all fitting yourself?
Absolutely. So, well, let me just very simply, if people don't have an idea of what complex adaptive systems are, let me just give a very brief primer. So all human systems are complex adaptive systems. And this is from Walter Buckley, you know, an understanding in social sciences from the 60s, right? So complex adaptive systems isn't anything particularly new. Complexity just means when something is complex, it means that it has multiple independent systems that are also interconnected. It's also called nested systems. And so because we can see all of these systems as independent. So we can see the system of operating in flight as one particular system. Then we have weather as another system. Then we have the way that the crew is interacting with each other as one system. And we have the way that the pilot is thinking as another system, right? Yeah. All of those can be understood as being independent of each other. But they also have influence on each other. They don't cause each other, but they have influence on each other. And so as they influence each other, and there's so many of them nested together, these emergent conditions arise out of interactions in these systems. So the system of the pilot's experience interacts with his experience or her experience of a change in the weather. And that creates a certain sort of reaction, which might be happening at the same time that there's something happening in the system of the plane, right? And all of these things interact at one time to either work or lead to some unexpected outcome as, an emergent condition that the pilot needs to react to. But let's say the pilot reacts to this emergent condition and there's the system of the crew interacting with each other, and that has an impact on the pilot's decision-making in that moment, based on what he's expecting or she's expecting other people to do. And so then that reaction right there also has an unpredictable, something that no one could have predicted on the ground happening in that particular moment. And so we're all dealing in emergent conditions. And so sometimes those emergent conditions lead to an unwanted outcome, and sometimes they just life goes on, right?
I guess so.
The thing about complex systems from a leadership management point of view is that they require constant, and the word that's often used is probing. And it's more than just monitoring, right? We use that term monitoring a lot in safety, but it requires probing. We have to be constantly curious about how all of these systems are interacting with each other for us to have any hope of being able to deal with some of these emergent conditions. And that is what adaptive meant. So, change is a response to feedback from these interactions, right? Change is limited to the latent potential in all of these systems. So the pilot can't react to the weather conditions beyond what is his or her potential to react, what their knowledge set, and their emotional abilities. And so there's a matter of fit that's happening as you adapt to these emergent conditions. And it can be maladaptive. We can maladapt.
Yeah.
And basically death is the failure to adapt in the system. And I say that because a really great example is evolution, right?
Mhm.
People, we talk about evolution and it's always talked like with some sort of intent, oh, the fish realized that, they couldn't live underwater anymore. And so they grew,
Yeah.
they grew, their fins turned into feet. And that's not how it works, right? We know that we have all of this, just this genetic potential inside of us. We have all of these, our genes are constantly mutating, and so much of these mutations just sit there as latent potential. We don't ever need them. We don't ever use them. It's like our genetics are rolling dice all the time. And every once in a while you get the right, conditions on the inside as match the changing conditions on the outside. So that's why, and this is the term that Todd uses. Todd says that safety isn't about prevention, it's about capacity. So having the capacity to adapt to all of these emergent conditions that are happening. And he's learned this from doing, I don't know how many investigations, I don't know how many industries, and realizing that just bad things happen, right? And if we look at this bad thing happening and we just say, okay, well, we're going to prevent this next time, we're going to make sure it never happens again. The nature of complex adaptive systems, it might never happen again. We might not ever have these conditions align like this again in our lifetime. It's really not about prevention. It's about having the capacity to adapt when unexpected emergent conditions align.
Yeah, I heard you speak on a podcast with Todd's, I think the latest one, and used the term adaptive defenses, which it conjures up a really new way to look at safety in the complex domain, rather than just looking at what's happened, trying to predict the future with what's happened. Future isn't going to be the same, because in a complex system there isn't cause and effect. It's dispositional. You can say it might tend towards this or that, but it probably won't, and it certainly might not. But so adaptive defenses sounded like a really amazing phrase to me. Okay.
I think and the defenses piece is, I think, really key. And we have to look at sort of, I've heard about the hierarchy of defenses, which are the, defenses in different domains of the process or of the operations. But there's also defenses of, I would think of it as more of in-system defenses and inter-systems defenses. So the emergence comes out in the interaction of these systems, the pilot's brain and the weather, right? That doesn't mean that we aren't going to continually improve the aircraft, right? We're not going to continually work to improve the processes as we get to understand the conditions in which we're working more.
Yeah, of course, that's got us here, hasn't it? That process. So we've done so well so far, so we don't throw it out. We're just adding in, aren't we?
But that's the, that's the in system. Like, okay, a system is, we have a general understanding of the conditions with this system. We know how things work within the system. We know what outcome we want out of it. And so that is something that's something that's relatively stable, that we know. I mean, and the change comes from the interaction with the other nested systems, but we still want to make each one of those individual systems as robust as possible. And we want them to have capacity for the emergent unknown.
Yeah. Excellent. That's really good. And that ties in nicely with our, as I said before, the conference we're having on the 12th on complexity. So hopefully we can explore that idea more with some people. So psychological safety, you've kind of explained where it fits in there with everything else. My impression of the way people look at psychological safety, certainly what I've seen, is in the same way they sort of look at safety too, or that's kind of doing things, seeing what goes right, or rather than, and they sort of narrow it down to a small, just a sort of phrase. Psychological safety, they do the same sort of thing where they say, oh, it's making everyone feel safe and nice and everyone can get along kind of thing. But I understand that's probably not what we're going for here.
No, that actually reduces capacity. And I mean, Amy Edmondson, in a podcast that I listened to not long ago that was with HBR, said, you know, she really regrets calling it psychological safety because that's how people interpret it based on that title, but that's not actually what it is. So if safety in general is not about prevention, it's about creating capacity for risk and failure. Psychological safety is the same thing. It's creating capacity for emotional risk and response to failure. So in psychological safety, you're dealing with building, and this is the term that I've been using in pulling together a lot of the things that I've been working on, is building psychological capacity. And building psychological capacity means, one, that you have emotional resilience, which is that you have the ability to respond constructively emotionally to lots of different situations, which ultimately is having the ability to emotionally regulate. Emotional regulation is very different from suppressing your emotions, not being emotional, you know, all of those things that sometimes we say, oh, well, don't be emotional. It's actually acknowledging your emotions, letting them, you know, expressing them in a constructive way, right? And learning from them, figuring out what those emotions are actually trying to tell you, because they're good information. Our emotions, we have two ways that we learn. We have our limbic system learning, and our limbic system is our emotional system. Our amygdala is in there. People talk about the amygdala a lot. And then we have our, you know, our prefrontal cortex, where we make decisions, and that's sort of our rational thinking learning system. Both of them, pain is a very important aspect of learning. Our rational thinking system, our prefrontal cortex learning, is through trial and error, right? And this is where, you know, the hops lived for a long time, right? We need error. We need failure to learn. We can't ignore failure. That's why Reason's blame cycle is so important, because blame drives down our ability to learn from failure. And so trial and error is absolutely essential to rational learning. Well, that's actually a very small part of our learning. Our behavior is actually driven 90%. So different neuroscientists throw out different numbers, but I'm going with 90%, right? 90% of our behavior is ultimately emotional, driven by emotions. Emotions are our biggest driver of our actions. And our emotional brain, our limbic brain, is actually pre-human. It's mammalian. It's all about survival. And so, the way that our limbic system learns is actually through intensity of emotion. The more intense our emotions, the more we're going to learn a certain lesson. And what that is, I mean, we think of it as our instinctual learning, because we, and other mammals as well, you know, we are alive because we're so quick to adapt to changes in the environment. You know, why do human beings live everywhere? Why do coyotes live everywhere? Why can house cats live beyond what we think are normal conditions for house cats? It's because they actually adapt to their environment by paying a lot of attention to little changes in our environment. Our subconscious is doing that all the time. We're having emotional reactions to them. We're setting up little rules. You know, thoughts are actually very flexible. And so they're flexible, much more flexible rules than anything that we kind of hardwire into ourselves. And then those thoughts lead us to reacting to things very differently. You know, cats seek out the sun. You know, we seek out shelter. All of that ultimately comes from our interaction with our environment and how it makes us feel. Because emotions bypass Our slower thinking processes, our prefrontal process, this is what people talk about a lot as amygdala hijack, you know, and out of fear, we're acting without thinking, flight, you know, a fight, flight, freeze, and then the fourth F. There's actually a fourth F, and that all ultimately is about survival. So when we think about building psychological capacity in organizations, we're tapping into the survival systems of human beings, their emotions and their thoughts, and how they create meaning out of their interactions with each other and with the environment.
Yeah. So this is going out mostly to sort of pilots, and we obviously, I think you've referenced it in the article you wrote for us, which will attach to this, is you wrote about crew resource management. So could you sort of explain the difference? Because I think a lot of people feel we cover this already with sort of crew resource management,
right,
courses, etc.
I guess the thing that really building psychological capacity comes down to is in your, there's the aspect of thinking about it as sort of your human resources and how you manage that, like how you manage people. But we're going beyond that a bit and recognizing that a key skill for any crew, any leader, is their ability to manage their own emotions. And another important skill is their ability to challenge their own biases, their own assumptions, their own view of the situation. So what comes into this is stuff that maybe you have had some training in. Certainly emotional intelligence comes into this, and certainly you know, kind of unconscious bias training comes into this. A lot of the skills that you need to drive complex thinking come out of the innovation world, right? The innovation space, design thinking, things like that. But it's a matter of integrating it into the organization. And another sort of thing to think about, and it really is kind of subtle, but it's very important, is that we tend to look at these sort of human aspects of things, and we want to manage them in an administrative way. So we think of them as administrative controls. And okay, well, you are duty bound to behave in this way in this situation. Or this is, you know, we're redefining, we're making our roles very clear. In our process, we're making it very clear what kind of decisions that you can make and how you should respond to them. And the fact is that completely misses the point. Use role processes and procedures, communication norms, and measurement, how we sort of measure what we reward, what we punish, are all extremely meaningful things. But administering them is very different from actually creating a meaning around them in the organization and helping people, creating psychological safety, for example, in a situation by making it meaningful to admit your failures, and not being just told, you have to admit, you have to bring this up. It has to be meaningful. You have to know, okay, this is really painful for me to do this, but it matters that I do this. I know that if I do this, I'm not going to be punished. And this is actually going to help the organization. So I am self-sacrificing in a way. You are kind of emotionally self-sacrificing in order for the larger common good. And people don't do that without their leaders creating a meaningful reason for them to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, you kind of stole a few questions I had there on how it was going to go back up the command chain and how HR processes fitted in and things like that. And this is exactly that, I guess, that you've been talking about there, and especially in the sort of, as well, on the top of the learning side of it as well. The whole organization needs to learn, not just individuals. And Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And I think that's a really good point. The whole organization needs to learn. And so when you think about having psychological capacity within an organization, you want to think about, well, am I really providing an opportunity for essentially diversity of action, diversity of feeling, and diversity of thought? Because these are the key things that we're working with when we work with meaning, right? Is emotions, thoughts, and actions. And so when you think about it, okay, well, for one thing, and I think this is in the article, is that psychological safety is not, I do not, I probably contradict with other people who talk about it, but it's not really a cultural thing. And you don't actually want it to be a cultural thing. It's not like you can create psychological safety within your organization or your organizational culture and set it and forget it. That's not adaptive, right? Culture is the way we do things around here, move down into the unconscious processes that people do when they work together. And people love culture and hate culture because it's such a hard, immovable object when you want to change it. But if it's what you want it to, everyone touts it as being, well, we have this great culture, and that's why everything works great. Right. But what you're talking about is a lot of unconscious stuff. And unfortunately, all of that unconscious stuff is not terribly adaptable in a complex system. It doesn't necessarily help you respond to emergence. There are some cultural things yet that you certainly want to drive, like curiosity. There's certainly, you want to build a culture of learning. That's great. But you can't rely on, in any interaction, that because you have a certain kind of culture, you can assume that everybody in that interaction, in that crew, in that particular team, in this particular interaction of people, that everyone's going to be psychologically safe. Because another thing that's happening in industry, and I don't know how much is happening within the airline industry, but we're having a lot more matrixed organizations. We're having a lot more people come together that have never met each other together to do a job based on their expertise. And so we have a lot of new teams forming and coming apart over and over and over again, right? And every new forming of a team, you have a whole new team dynamic, and you don't have psychological safety. I can pretty much say that. I'm pretty confident in saying, anytime you form a new team, you don't have psychological safety, because psychological safety is a group phenomenon where everybody shares a belief that it is okay to take emotional risks. And if you have new people coming together, they don't yet have time, right, to form a shared belief. And they're looking at each other and their differences, and the way that our brains work. We are so focused on whether we belong or don't belong. We have, the common knowledge effect is a very strong bias when you deal with teams of experts that come together that have never met each other before. You have teams of experts, you've hired them for their unique information, their unique expertise, and all they share with each other is what they know in common. And you lose that unique expertise.
The powers in the diversity, isn't it? So
the powers in the diversity. So the same thing really in trying to build psychological capacity in your organization. The power is in the diversity. The power is in the diversity of emotions that people are allowed to have at work. The diversity, and I think about it this way, do you have, psychological capacity? The way to think about it is, how many identities can people safely have within your organization? Are people really stuck in particular identities, which those identities, create some very narrow roles in which people don't feel like they can step out of them. And if they can't step out of those identities or those narrow roles within the organization, then they can't really be agile and adapt to emergent situations. what are the things that people can do and can't do? Are there a lot of things that people can't do?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of possibility in what people can do in the organization? And so if there is, some opportunity for what I can do, and what are the things that I can question? And are there things in the organization that I absolutely can't question? If you have a lot of things that you can't question in the organization, and I'm not necessarily saying formally, I mean, this is like figuring out, are there things that really are taboo in your organization? Well, then if there's a lot of taboos in your organization, then you don't have a lot of capacity, right? Emotional, psychological capacity. Is there a lot of restriction around what I can say, who I can say it to, and how I can say it? And if those are restricted, if you see a lot of restrictions in that, then you're lowering your psychological capacity. And and think about what people are praised for and what they're punished for. Are they praised for curiosity, or are they punished for curiosity?
Sure.
All of these sorts of things that you need in order to do robust problem solving. You need expectations to be sort of openly discussed, and
Yeah.
also to be kind of broad. You do need boundaries. You need healthy emotional boundaries,
Yeah.
because you can end up with situations where a lot of toxicity is happening, but you want to have healthy emotional boundaries, but that means you have to be able to talk about your emotions. So it's not like it's all about, free for all. You do need expectations. You do need emotional boundaries. You need all of that. But those are the parts of things that help people feel safe.
Sure.
What you don't want is for people to think that reactions to failure, reactions to emotional situations are unpredictable.
Yeah.
There needs to be some kind of emotional, psychological predictability, but it also needs to be pretty inclusive as well.
And I guess in this sort of day and age of COVID and the pandemic, I guess companies are really moving away from that almost, aren't they? The pressure is to fall back on what you know, do it the same way you have, kind of avoid diversity just in case it goes wrong, because the situation is so unknown. You don't want to add more unknowns almost, don't you? So
but that's really the opposite reaction. When something is unknown, that means that you do not have the data to make good decisions about how to protect against it. So what you actually need to be doing in an unknown situation is doing micro experiments. Basically, you take your unknown field, you look at what's right in front of you and go, okay, what is my best guess of what would happen if I do this? Never done this before. Never done this before in this situation. What's my best guess if I do this? And then you're conscious about, your hypothesis is your best guess. You do that, and you get the reaction that you expect, or you don't get the reaction that you expect. Either way, that's good information. Now you've learned a little bit more about the nature of this unknown field that you're in, and you just keep going. I mean, it's like, crossing a raging river. You're picking a rock in that moment, and you're jumping on that rock because in that moment that rock is exposed, and then you're looking for the next rock and you're jumping on that rock in that moment. The thing is that in a dynamic, unknown environment like a river, right, you have to choose your rocks quickly, because you can't stand on that rock because the conditions are likely to change. So it is actually counterintuitive what you're supposed to do in an unknown environment, but what you really, really need in an unknown environment is this bravery, right? This emotional and cognitive bravery. I am going to challenge my emotion. I'm going to do things that are really, really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I am going to let my brain go to the unknown, which is very uncomfortable.
Yeah. No, that's great. Again, in the article, you mentioned measurement, and essentially what we measure signals what we find important.
Mm-hmm.
Again, in that kind of scenario, you're obviously going to have to start measuring some different stuff if the environment's changing like that. Then
yeah, I mean, there's this whole there's a big debate, in safety around measurement, and certainly, in a sense, all measurement. There's this whole idea of trying to have leading indicators versus lagging indicators. But in a way, and Todd always says this, that if you measure something, it's really always a lagging indicator anyway.
Yeah.
So this search for leading indicators can be a bit difficult to actually find. And the thing here with complexity is that what you really want to be doing is probing. So that process of micro experimentation,
Mm-hmm.
having your best guess, doing something, and then seeing what happens, where you're actually making data, right? You're making data by doing stuff and seeing what the response is.
Yeah.
That, I think, is what probing is, and that takes a lot of emotional and cognitive
Yeah.
resilience.
And on a slightly larger scale, though, looking in from a company sort of perspective, it's helpful to make is it? I'm asking you, so making a sense-making sort of program where you find the narratives from lots of different people, because there maybe isn't just one truth in that scenario, but it's good to pull out a number of stories rather than just individual bits and pieces. So in essence, you are probing in that way because you're getting lots of different people to give you these stories back.
Yeah, and that's, I think, really important. And I mean, the truth is that the way, companies aren't really made, organizations aren't really made of the buildings and the systems and the equipment. I mean, ultimately, companies are made out of narrative. Narrative is how we interact with each other. So being able to identify all those different narratives, it shows you the breadth of the context in which everybody operates. And of course, context is meaningful because context drives behavior. And that's one of Todd's principles.
Yeah.
And so that narrative piece is also really important. The other piece, I think, with measurement is recognize that measurement creates a narrative. I'm not against measurement. I mean, I come more from a strategy background, right? Where you have to, you're implementing a strategy. A strategy is an experiment, a big, grand experiment in how you deal with your competitive environment and your resources and your core skills of your particular organization. And you really need to see how well your strategy is working. And your strategy has a goal. It has an end. There's nothing wrong with goals. People, most people don't get anywhere without having goals. The thing that is problematic in a complex environment is having those measurements be the same, those lagging indicators be the same, and the goals never changing, right? The whole thing is that it has to be dynamic. And so like the dashboard idea, it's kind of great, but it's not. It needs to be more dynamic. Essentially, you should be identifying 5 things that you're paying attention to, and you should be changing them all the time, because you know that of those 5 measurements that you're looking at, you're only sort of looking at a certain little indication in one particular area, whether it's your leadership area, or your financial area, or your production area in your strategy, right? And so you're only looking at you're using one little measurement to see one piece of it. It's like only looking at your weight to have a measurement of your health. You have to, I don't advocate having a gazillion KPIs. I think that's crazy. But you have a few KPIs for now.
Yeah.
And then you switch them. So this month I'm looking at my weight. Next month, I'm looking at my cardio capacity. The next time I'm looking at how far I can run in 10 minutes, right? They
Yeah.
all are sort of looking at the same thing, but none of them are sufficient. Trying to over measure, though,
Yeah.
at one time has all sorts of problems with, taking it back to what you're saying, the narrative, right?
Yeah.
People get over focused on all that matters is, how much I weigh, what the margin is on this particular deal, how many people we manage to get from point A or point B. And that focusing on any of those one areas can take you into a detrimental space because you're trying to beat the measurement, make your performance all about that one thing. And we know that organizations are much more complex and robust than that. People are much more complex and
Yeah.
robust than that. And if you define performance that one way, you actually don't have a sustainable operation.
Yeah. So you're almost putting a framework on something that defies a framework, and then you're trying to force that framework to work.
Yeah. I think people understand it when they think about health. If it's if health is all about being a certain weight or being thin, or, we know that ultimately becomes detrimental, that that's one measurement in the whole list of things that we use to monitor.
Yeah, I think the next conference we're doing on complexities with some of the guys from the Cynefin Foundation, and I like their phrase, managing the evolutionary potential of the system, rather than setting fixed goals. As you say, you push it in a direction, and quite often you can get better things because you haven't seen something coming, and you can swerve off and do something else instead. But
yeah, absolutely. And probing comes from the Cynefin model.
Yeah. Cool. Just one last thing. I quite liked the bit you wrote on after action reviews. So we did our previous safety conference. We had Ivan Papalidian, who has done a load of work. I think he actually flew for the American Air Force at one stage, and they have after action reviews there. And I really liked what he said, and obviously you've put that in as well because you've identified it as good. Are you able to?
Yeah, Ivan actually, I think, flew for the Coast Guard. He also lives in Santa Fe. He's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
And so this after action review thing, I think, is an important tool, right, for organizational learning and HOP. Where it fits in with psychological safety is that you can do after action reviews all day long. And if you haven't created a psychologically safe environment where people feel that it's okay to question, authority, or, question the, processes that might be, in the narrative of the organization considered sacred, then you're not actually going to learn anything. If people are able to talk about what they might see as a failure, and not see that talking about failure as blame, then you're able to really learn something. But if you put an after action review into a dynamic where people feel like if somebody criticizes something around this process, they're criticizing me, and they get defensive, then you're not going to get good information. So I think it depends on every leader of those interactions to really think about, how can I make sure that people are not going to be defensive? How am I going to make sure that everybody feels like they can be curious in their probing and their questioning? How can I make it safe for people to sort of stand up and say that that something didn't feel right, but they didn't understand why? And that's, I think, something really that a lot of experts feel very uncomfortable doing, is saying, didn't feel good about this, and I don't really know why. Nothing really bad happened. Oh, I know I'm supposed to be rational. But the truth is that our limbic brain, and this, there's a Blink, was a book that was sort of written about this. Our limbic brain is our intuitive brain. And so back there, those emotions are actually telling us about changes in the environment that we're not comfortable with because it's not like it used to be. But they're so subtle. And if there isn't consequence, if there isn't a bad outcome, we tend to dismiss it. But we want to, the whole concept of pre-accident investigation, the whole idea of how is to find where things are shifting that might be shifting in a wrong direction or an unwanted direction before we get the bad consequence. So being able to talk about your feelings is something that's really important in and post-job briefs.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's my entire career has been sort of focused on keeping feelings out of it. I think I am a pilot. And I think it's now I do a bit of reading on anthropology and all the other stuff. It is important. It fits in beautifully with narrative and pulling out different views of what's happening. And you need those feelings.
You can't, the thing is that you can't keep feelings out of it. The key thing is to know what those feelings are and whether they matter or don't matter. Biases are just mental shortcuts that actually, drive you towards expertise that helps you do things really quickly. They are feeling based, right? The problem is when those rules, those shortcuts no longer fit the emergent conditions that you're in. The world has changed and it no longer fits. Well, your feelings are what tell you that it doesn't fit. And so if you pay attention to them, they are, you have one part of your brain that's operating, trying to normalize everything and get rid of everything that doesn't seem relevant. And then there's another part of your brain that is just scanning for any little change, and that triggers an emotion. You have to pay attention to both of that. Both of those, we have both of them for a reason. We did not lose our limbic system when we developed our neocortex for a reason, because our limbic system helps us survive.
Yeah, very important. Thanks for that. Is there anything major I've missed out asking you, do you think?
No, I don't think so. There's a lot more to delve into this. And I think on two levels, the switch in how we see safety from being prevention to being capacity is actually huge.
Yeah.
It's a big switch in how we see risk. And emotional risk is, a risk as well. And we in safety think that we're eliminating risk, and that is not the case. We engage, you engage in the crazy act of taking this really heavy vehicle and putting it in the sky for the gain that provides. Human beings engage in high risk behavior to get high reward. That risk never really goes away, right? We need to be able to embrace that risk. And it's a matter of, creating adaptive defenses around the potential bad consequences that can arise in that risk. But we don't ever really eliminate risk. And that's why that prevention idea isn't it's not wrong. It's worked, right? To a certain degree, but we have to kind of evolve out of that and have a different view of risk so that we can engage in the emotionally risky behaviors that we need to deal with complexity.
Yeah, that's for all these safety conferences that we do at BALPA, that's the message, is the paradigm shift of the understanding of complexity and the nature of the system and how you deal with it. Just sort of moving on from that, trying to cancel risk out scenario.
Yeah.
It's what got us here, but there's more now. We can
Yeah.
go further, I guess.
Yeah, we can go a lot further. I mean, and that's the beautiful thing about I'm sort of rejoining the safety world, is it's just a great community of curious, intelligent people who have a shared purpose. And that shared purpose piece is one of those things that um, create one of those boundaries that are very important for us to maintain.
Mhm.
You can have a shared purpose among a diverse group of people, among diverse activity, and all of that can lead towards one shared purpose. So if there's nothing else that you have to create psychological safety in a particular situation, the
Mhm.
first thing to do as a leader is to make sure that everybody in that interaction, everybody in that group is very clear on the shared purpose that everybody has there. Why are we all here and what are we doing together?
Yeah.
And that still allows everybody to come at that shared purpose, maybe with a different strategy, with a different approach, with a different perspective, with a different narrative. That's cool. The purpose it's a very important aspect of creating that safeness. I know why I'm here. I know why I'm here with these people.
Yeah, amazing. That's really great. Um, I noticed as well that in some of your literature on your website, you had further reading. So if
Mm-hmm.
people wanted to get started on it, you got some recommendations there off the top of your head?
Well, right off the top of my head, I really love Amy Edmondson's The Fearless Organization. There's lots of good examples there, and she's really looking at high reliability organizations and high reliability industries like the airline industry. So I think there'll be a lot of things that resonate there. And I mean, I think that's the sort of the first primer in psychological safety. And then there's also some really great books in sort of emotional intelligence. I'm I'm less into the Daniel Goleman books on emotional intelligence, and I'm more into the ones that are sort of cognitively based. So I'm trying to remember the author off the top of my head, but the book is Emotional Intelligence at Work, and it's by a psychologist. And so there's lots of very practical ways to build your emotional intelligence and ultimately your emotional resiliency. Another person who talks about emotional agility out there in the world, she's originally from South Africa, and Susan David. And she's a professor in the Harvard Medical School, but she has lots of TED Talks out there. And so she talks about the importance of emotional resilience. So yeah, there's lots of stuff.
Okay,
I could go
that's
on.
awesome. Thanks. I'll maybe get some. If you could write them down, I'll stick them on the website next to the video,
Okay.
so
Okay,
they can
great.
give people some further reading. Um, I think that's it for now.
Great.
Is that? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for giving up your time. That's really great for us. I mean, without this sort of thing, how are we all going to move on? It's
Well, I really appreciate you asking me to talk about this. As you can tell, I'm pretty excited about it. I think
yeah,
it's this is a great community, and as long as we continue to move towards our purpose of making sure that everybody lives through their jobs, then we can really do some good things.